She bought an old mill for only $500 to quickly resell it and pay off her debts. But under the house, she and her daughter found something that changed their lives forever. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Melissa Hayes had stopped counting the number of times she'd started over. Each attempt seemed to begin with a half-empty coffee cup, a cluttered kitchen table, and the same hollow silence of her small apartment in Portland, Maine. Once, not long ago, she'd been a respected real estate agent, the kind who wore neat blazers, carried confidence like perfume, and signed contracts with a steady hand. But things had fallen apart fast. A client had sued her after a property inspection went wrong, and though she wasn't at fault, the lawsuit drained her savings and her reputation. The agency she'd built from scratch folded within months. Her name, once displayed on billboards along the coast, had disappeared like chalk in the rain. Now, at 42, she was working freelance, selling low-end rentals and foreclosure listings to clients who didn't remember her past success. Her days were filled with calls that went nowhere, emails that never got answered, and a constant gnawing thought that maybe she'd missed her last real chance. The only thing that kept her from collapsing under the weight of it all was her daughter, Claire. At 13, the girl had inherited her father's impatience and Melissa's quiet resilience. She watched her mother with a mixture of sympathy and frustration, asking questions Melissa couldn't answer about money, the future, and why everything always seemed to fall apart again. The apartment smelled faintly of damp wood that winter evening when Melissa found the listing. She'd been scrolling through government foreclosure auctions, a habit she called wishful research, though it was closer to desperation. The words on the screen caught her off guard. Old water mill for sale. Franklin County. Starting bid, $500. Condition, non-residential, unsafe structure. Buyer assumes full liability. She clicked the photos. The building leaned toward a river, its walls streaked with algae and moss. The roof sagged. A wheel half submerged in dark water looked ready to crumble. Still, there was something solid beneath the ruin-old stone. Thick beams, the outline of a place that had once mattered. Claire came into the kitchen, headphones around her neck. "Please tell me you're not working again," she said. "Just looking," Melissa murmured. "A property up north. A mill." Her daughter frowned. "Mom, you said we can't even afford a new water heater." "It's $500, Melissa replied, half smiling. "Cheaper than that heater." Claire rolled her eyes. She was used to her mother's sudden ideas, the fixer-uppers, the maybe this will save us projects. None had ever saved them, but something in Melissa refused to quit. She'd been raised to believe that places could heal people, that walls, when mended, could hold a second chance. That night, she lay awake, listening to the radiator hiss, thinking about that mill. $500. It sounded absurd. It was absurd. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this was a test, one last offer from the world, a coin tossed in her direction before the curtain fell. By morning, she'd decided to go see it. The drive took 6 hours. They left before dawn in Melissa's dented pickup, the back loaded with tools, blankets, and a coffee thermos that had survived more road trips than either of them could count. Maine's forests were waking up from winter. Patches of fog clung to the valleys, and the roads curved between bare trees and icy rivers. Claire sat beside her, bundled in a sweatshirt, staring out the window with the wary silence of a child who doesn't want to argue but doesn't believe either. They reached Franklin County by early afternoon. The road narrowed to gravel, and the GPS lost signal. When they finally spotted the structure, it looked less like a house and more like a memory someone had forgotten to bury. The mill stood at the edge of a sluggish river, its wheel tilted at an angle, half buried in silt. The wooden siding was gray and blistered. The door hung crookedly from one hinge. Melissa cut the engine. The sound of water and wind filled the air. "Well," she said softly, "here she is." Claire folded her arms. "She's dead, Mom." Melissa stepped out anyway. The ground was soft, cold mud sucking at her boots. Up close, the building didn't look as hopeless. The stone base was intact, and when she pushed the door open, the hinges groaned but didn't break. Inside, the air smelled of old flour and river dampness. Light filtered through gaps in the walls, cutting the darkness into uneven stripes. Broken machinery lay scattered across the floor gears, belts, and pieces of wood, worn smooth by decades of use. Above her, beams crossed like ribs, holding the weight of history. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, where a small room overlooked the river. The glass panes were gone, but the view stretched far brown water curling around the bend, reeds moving in the breeze. She tried to picture it alive. The wheel turning, men shouting orders, the hum of work. Instead, she saw herself standing there, hammer in hand, paint under her nails. She could almost hear the sound of a second chance, slow and steady, like the rhythm of the current. Claire waited outside, skipping stones. "Mom, it's falling apart," she said when Melissa joined her. "What are we supposed to do here?" "Fix it," Melissa said simply. "Sell it. Maybe make something right for once." They spent the night in the truck. The cold seeped through the windows, and the river kept whispering, a sound both soothing and restless. Melissa barely slept. She thought of her debts, the letter from the bank threatening foreclosure, the phone calls she ignored. But she also thought of the foundation beneath her feet, the way the stones held firm despite the years. Something about that steadiness comforted her. The next morning, she drove into town to sign the paperwork. The county clerk, a balding man named Harris, seemed surprised anyone wanted the property. "That place floods every spring," he warned. "You sure you want it?" "I've seen worse," she replied, forcing a smile. He shrugged, stamped the forms, and slid them across the counter. "It's yours then. No refunds." $500 changed hands. Just like that, she owned something again. Back at the mill, Melissa unlocked the padlock on the front door and stepped inside with a surge of purpose. She set up a camping stove, unfolded 2 cots upstairs, and declared the room their temporary home. Claire didn't protest this time. She was tired, perhaps resigned. They spent the afternoon sweeping debris, opening windows, airing out decades of dust and silence. By sunset, faint golden light touched the walls, and for a brief moment, the place looked alive again. That night, they ate soup from cans, sitting on the floor by lantern light. Melissa watched her daughter's face, thin, serious, older than it should have been. "You know," she said quietly, "this isn't forever. Just until I can sell it." Claire nodded, but didn't answer. Outside, the river murmured like an old friend. Days turned into a routine. Melissa patched holes, cleared broken boards, and called a local handyman named Ben Lawson, who agreed to help for cash. He was in his late 60s, with a slow drawl and eyes that carried too many Maine winters. "This old place used to feed the whole town," he told her, while checking the supports. "Back in the 30s, everyone brought grain here. Then came the flood. Changed the river's course. Folks packed up and never came back." He paused, tapping a beam with his knuckle. "Funny thing, though. The ground here's still wet, even in dry season. Some say there's a spring under it." Melissa smiled politely. "Sounds like a legend." "Maybe," Ben said, tightening a bolt. "Or maybe the earth just remembers what we forget." At night, Melissa wrote notes in a spiral notebook. Materials needed, potential buyers, estimated costs. The numbers didn't add up, but she kept writing. She told herself this was her project, her redemption. Yet sometimes, when the wind slipped through the cracks and the wheel creaked faintly against the current, she felt something strange, like the house was breathing, not in a haunting way, but as if it, too, wanted to be restored. One morning she found a faded wooden sign beneath a pile of junk. Brook and Sons Mill, 1904. The paint was chipped, the letters uneven, but she cleaned it and leaned it against the wall. It reminded her that people before her had built this with their hands and faith, not spreadsheets. Maybe that was what she'd lost somewhere along the way. The following week brought rain. The sound on the roof was steady and comforting, a rhythm that filled the hollow spaces inside her. Claire began sketching by the window, capturing the view of the river. She didn't talk much, but Melissa noticed small things. The girl stopped wearing her headphones all day, started walking along the bank in the afternoons. The silence between them softened. In the evenings, Melissa sat near the window, reading real estate listings on her laptop, trying to picture the mill restored and ready for sale. She imagined a headline: "Historic Riverside Property, perfect for artists or vacationers." Maybe someone would fall in love with it the way she almost had. Maybe that would be enough. But when she closed her laptop and looked around the dim room, the lantern light trembling across the walls, the sound of water outside, she couldn't deny the uneasy feeling creeping in. The place didn't want to be sold. It wanted to be lived in. She brushed the thought away. Sentiment never paid bills. On the 12th night, she woke suddenly. The rain had stopped, and the air was so still it felt unnatural. Downstairs, something groaned, a slow, rhythmic creak. She grabbed the flashlight and descended the stairs. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on the mill wheel outside, moving ever so slightly, pushed by the current. It hadn't turned in decades, yet now it shifted, 1 inch at a time, water glistening on its rotten wood. Melissa stood there barefoot on the cold floor, watching. The sound was deep and steady, like a heartbeat rising from the earth. For a moment, she felt a shiver, not of fear, but of recognition. It was as if the place was answering her persistence, acknowledging her effort. She whispered, "I'm not giving up either." Outside, the first light of dawn crept across the river. The fog hung low, curling around the wheel, blurring the line between water and sky. Claire stirred upstairs, calling for her mother. Melissa turned off the flashlight and stood in the half-light, listening. The mill wasn't just a ruin anymore. It was beginning to wake up. And somewhere deep inside her, so was she. The sound of the river carried into the morning, steady and endless, whispering of things still hidden beneath the earth, things waiting to be found. Melissa didn't know yet what the land was holding, or how much it would change her life. She only knew that, for the first time in years, she wasn't running from something. She was standing still, on her own ground, breathing the same air as the past. When the sun finally broke through the fog and painted the old sign gold, she smiled. The mill smelled of mold and history, of rot and potential. It was everything she'd been broken, quiet and somehow still standing. And that, she thought, was a start. Morning came quiet and gray, the kind of misty light that blurs the line between earth and sky. The river outside the mill was calm again, carrying away the last traces of the night's storm. Melissa stood at the window, her coffee cooling in her hand, watching how the fog moved over the water like breath. The wheel outside no longer turned, but the sight of it half submerged and still glistening stayed in her mind. It had moved on its own the night before. She hadn't imagined that. Something deep in the current had pushed it, awakened it for just a moment. The thought gave her a strange comfort, as if the place had acknowledged her presence. Claire came down the narrow stairs, still rubbing her eyes, her sketchbook under one arm. "You were up early again," she said. couldn't sleep," Melissa replied. "I think the rain helped the river. The current's stronger." Claire shrugged, poured herself cereal from the box, and sat cross-legged on the floor. "You're obsessed with that wheel." Melissa smiled faintly. "Maybe. But when something starts to move again after so long, it feels like a good sign." The air inside the mill was fresher now that they'd opened the windows. Dust still hung in corners, but sunlight found its way through. Over the next days, their routine deepened. Melissa divided her time between clearing debris, scrubbing walls, and contacting potential buyers. None of the calls went far. Most people lost interest the moment she mentioned flood risk. Still, she persisted. Every evening she told herself that one more coat of paint, one more repair, would make the difference. It was Ben Lawson who broke the monotony. He arrived in his old pickup with tools rattling in the back, a wool cap pulled low over his ears. "Told you this place had bones," he said, stepping inside. "Good ones, too. You keep patching it up. Might just remember what it's for." Melissa laughed. "I'm just trying to keep it standing until I sell it." Ben gave her a look, half amused, half doubtful. "Sure you are." He worked slowly, methodically, the way old craftsmen do. Together, they replaced floorboards, sealed leaks, and cleared out the basement that had become a storage room for generations of dust. It was there, beneath the old machinery and wooden crates, that the first sign of the land's secret appeared. One afternoon, while digging out a corner to reinforce the foundation, Ben's shovel struck something soft and wet. "That's strange," he murmured, crouching down. He dug deeper, and water began to seep up from the ground, clear and cold. Within minutes, the soil turned slick. "Looks like the ground's bleeding," he said with a chuckle, but his brow furrowed. Melissa knelt beside him, dipping her fingers into the puddle. The water was icy, and when she lifted her hand, it was perfectly clear. "Could it be a broken pipe?" "There ain't any plumbing down here, not from this old era," Ben said. "If I had to guess, I'd say you just tapped into something natural." They left a bucket overnight, and by morning it had filled itself again. That was when Melissa started to wonder if Ben's story about the spring under the mill had been more than folklore. She collected a sample in a glass jar and drove to the small-town lab 20 miles away. The technician, a young man who looked barely out of college, ran a quick test. When he returned with the results, he sounded surprised. "This is some of the cleanest groundwater I've seen. No contaminants, no nitrates. It's practically bottled water quality." Melissa blinked. "You're serious?" He nodded. "If it's really a spring, it's valuable. People pay for rights to this kind of source." Driving back through the forest roads, Melissa felt her pulse quicken. For the first time in years, her mind filled with numbers that weren't depressing, calculations of worth, potential deals, what a parcel with a freshwater spring could mean. Yet even as she thought about it, another feeling crept in. Something like hesitation. She'd bought the mill planning to fix and sell it, but now the ground beneath her feet whispered of something older, something that didn't want to be reduced to a transaction. That night, she told Claire about the test results. The girl listened, half interested, sketching the outline of the wheel in her notebook. "So you found water. Isn't that good?" "It might be very good," Melissa said, sitting beside her. "If this is an actual spring, companies might want to buy the land." Claire looked up. "You'd sell it?" "That's why we came here," Melissa reminded her gently. "To sell." Claire hesitated. "But I like it here. It's quiet. You don't look so tired here." Melissa touched her daughter's hair, smiling with both pride and sorrow. "Sweetheart, peace doesn't pay the bills." The next morning, Ben returned, and she told him about the test results. He nodded slowly. Doesn't surprise me. These hills are full of water, old river veins. But if word gets around, you'll have men sniffing around like coyotes. He was right. Within 2 weeks, word somehow reached a local company, Clearflow Water, a regional supplier. Their representative, a tall man with a corporate smile and 2 clean boots, showed up unannounced in a silver SUV. He introduced himself as Mr. Harlow, handed Melissa a card, and said, "We've heard about your property, Ms. Hayes. We'd like to make you an offer." They met inside the mill, sunlight cutting through the gaps in the boards. Harlow laid a folder on the table: blueprints, purchase documents, estimates. "We'd like to buy the land outright," he said. $60,000. We'll handle all taxes, surveys, and demolition. You'll be free and clear." "Demolition," Melissa repeated. He nodded. "To access the springs safely, the structure will have to be removed. It's not stable anyway." The words echoed inside her like a dull thud. Removed. The idea of this place, its beams, its wheel, its smell of time being flattened by machines, made her chest tighten. "I'll need time to think," she said. Harlow smiled, as though expecting that. "Of course. Just know the offer expires at the end of the month. After that, our focus moves elsewhere." When he left, the silence in the mill felt heavier. Claire stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "They're going to destroy it?" "If I sell," Melissa said. "Don't," the girl pleaded. "We can fix it. We're already fixing it." Melissa wanted to argue, to remind her daughter about debts, tuition, all the unpaid bills waiting back in Portland. But she couldn't form the words. She looked at the floor instead, where the water still glimmered faintly between cracks, steady and alive. For the next few days, she tried to distract herself with work repainting walls, taking photos, sending new listings online. But no buyer could match Clearflow's offer. Every evening she returned to the same dilemma. $60,000 meant freedom. It meant no more letters from the bank, no more pretending everything was fine. And yet every time she imagined the bulldozers rolling in, her stomach turned. Ben seemed to sense the storm inside her. One afternoon, as they repaired the window frame, he said quietly, "Money comes and goes. But some places, once you let them go, they don't come back." She gave him a tired smile. "You sound like my daughter." "She sounds like someone who knows the worth of quiet," he said, hammering another nail. "That's rarer than money these days." As the end of the month approached, the tension between Melissa and Claire grew. The girl barely spoke during meals. She spent most of her time near the river, drawing or building little towers of stones. Sometimes Melissa watched her from the window, thinking of how strange it was that this wild, damp place had softened her daughter in ways no city ever had. The thought of leaving hurt more than she wanted to admit. The final week arrived with heavy skies. One evening, while sorting through an old trunk in the attic, Melissa discovered a small wooden box carved with initials E.B. Inside were brittle papers, faded photographs, and a folded map. The photos showed a family standing proudly beside the same mill, a century younger, but recognizable. On the back of one photo, someone had written, "Ellen Brooks and family, 1932. The map, drawn in careful ink, marked the property lines, and the note, "Natural source beneath wheel." The words sent a chill down her spine. The spring had been known, treasured even, long before she came along. She read through a few handwritten notes, ledgers, letters, fragments of a life spent here. One sentence, scribbled in faded ink, stood out. "The river moved, but the heart stayed." It felt like a message across time. Melissa sat for a long moment in the dust, the papers trembling slightly in her hands. For the first time, She wondered if she was meant to find this place, not to sell it, but to understand it. That night, the argument with Claire came to a breaking point. The girl stood by the window, tears on her cheeks. "You always sell everything, Mom," she said. "Every time we start somewhere new, you sell it and we leave. I'm tired of leaving." Melissa's voice cracked. "I'm doing this for us. You don't know what it's like to owe everyone." "I don't care about money," Claire shouted. "I care about you being happy for once." Silence filled the room, broken only by the distant rush of the river. Melissa wanted to speak, to explain that happiness was a luxury she couldn't afford. But the words died in her throat. She spent the rest of the night sitting on the porch, watching the mist rise. The moonlight shimmered on the river's surface, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw movement, the wheel again, turning slightly, pushed by the unseen current. She rose, barefoot, and walked closer. The ground was wet beneath her feet, the air sharp with the scent of cold water. The wheel shifted once more, creaking softly, and then stilled. She stood there for a long time, feeling the pull of the river, the hum of the land beneath her. It felt alive. It felt like a pulse. When dawn came, the decision still hadn't settled in her mind. But deep down, she sensed that the land itself had already made its choice. It wasn't meant to be sold. Not like that. Not for profit or convenience. It was meant to be cared for, to continue its slow breathing in the quiet corner of the world. By the end of that week, she had to give Clearflow an answer. The folder sat on her table, neat and threatening. $60,000. Freedom, with conditions. Claire had gone to town with Ben for groceries, leaving the house unusually silent. Melissa stared at the papers, then at the old photographs of Ellen Brooks on the wall, the proud woman beside her mill. Somewhere behind those eyes was the same stubbornness she felt now. She thought about what the technician had said, that the water was pure, worth more than she realized. But maybe its worth wasn't meant to be extracted and bottled. Maybe it was meant to stay, just as it was. When Claire returned, Melissa had already folded the contract shut. "We're not selling," she said quietly. Her daughter froze, eyes wide, unsure if she'd heard right. "You mean it?" Melissa nodded. "We'll find another way. Maybe something better." Claire ran to hug her, and for the first time in months, Melissa let herself cry. The weight she'd been carrying didn't vanish, but it shifted lighter, as if shared with the land itself. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing through the reeds along the riverbank, whispering approval. The mill stood solid and silent, but something in its old bones seemed to hum again, as if grateful for the reprieve. Melissa didn't yet know what would come next, how the spring would change everything, how the land would repay her faith. All she knew was that, for the first time in years, she had chosen not out of fear, but out of belief. And that, perhaps, was what the land had been waiting for. As night fell, she placed the photograph of Ellen Brooks on the windowsill, facing the river. The woman's face caught the faint light of the lantern, watching over the house like an old guardian. Melissa whispered into the dark, "I'll take care of it." The wheel outside gave one slow, soft turn, and then the night grew still. The night after Melissa turned down Clearflow's offer was the first time she truly slept. The kind of sleep that comes when exhaustion and conviction finally meet halfway. Outside, the river moved in the dark, steady and quiet, as if the land itself had heard her decision and relaxed. When she opened her eyes the next morning, the air felt lighter, and even the light coming through the cracks in the wall seemed warmer, softer somehow. For the first time since arriving, she didn't feel like a visitor. She felt like she belonged there. The mill, with all its creaks and flaws, had accepted her. She brewed coffee on the small camping stove, listening to the faint hum of water under the floorboards. Claire stirred on her cot, blinking at the sunlight. "Did you really tell them no?" she murmured. "I did," Melissa replied. "We're staying, for now." Claire smiled sleepily. "Good. I like the sound the river makes in the mornings." It was a small, ordinary exchange, but it filled the room with a kind of peace Melissa hadn't known in years. Still, peace didn't pay debts. She knew that soon enough she'd have to turn her decision into a plan. Saying no to Clearflow meant saying yes to something uncertain, something harder. She had spent most of her adult life learning how to sell houses, not how to hold on to one. But maybe, she thought, this place wasn't something to hold. Maybe it was something to protect. She spent that day on the porch, going through the old documents she and Claire had found in the attic. The map of the land was precise, hand-drawn, with the spring clearly marked beneath the mill. There were old property numbers, legal coordinates, and margins of the former owner's handwriting. At the bottom of the map was a faint stamp. Franklin County Water Division, 1933. It meant the spring had once been registered officially. If she could restore that status, perhaps the property could be classified as a natural heritage site. The idea seemed almost impossible for someone like her, but it gave her something solid to reach for. Ben came by that afternoon to check the roof. When she told him she had refused the company's offer, he only nodded. "Didn't think you'd take it," he said. "This place suits you." "Suits me?" she laughed. "It leaks, it creaks, and it's half rotten." "Yeah," he said, smiling, "but it's still standing." Together they fixed the outer boards and tightened the wheel supports. Every now and then, Ben would stop to watch the water spill across the old blades. "You know," he said, "back in the day, folks around here called this place a working soul. They said the mill ran because it wanted to. Maybe that's still true." Melissa didn't answer, but something in those words settled deep in her mind. Over the next few weeks, she learned more about property law than she had in her entire career. She called county offices, researched environmental statutes, and wrote emails late into the night. Most responses were vague or unhelpful, but one name kept resurfacing, an environmental assessor named Laura Peterson, who specialized in private water rights. When Melissa finally reached her, Laura agreed to visit. The day she arrived, the sky was a clean blue, and the fields shimmered from the previous night's rain. The woman stepped out of her SUV, wearing boots and a professional curiosity. "So this is the famous $500 property," she said with a grin. Melissa smiled, though her stomach twisted with nerves. "That's the one." Laura spent the afternoon testing samples, measuring depth, recording coordinates. When she finished, she took off her gloves and said, "Well, Miss Hayes, you're sitting on something rare. This spring is active, clean, and entirely natural. With the right documentation, it could be classified as a private conservation site." "What would that mean?" "It means you keep ownership," Laura explained, "but you can partner with certified companies to license the water, not sell it. You'd maintain the land, and they'd pay for access. It's more sustainable, and usually, in the long run, more profitable." Melissa stood in silence, absorbing the words. The land wouldn't be destroyed. It would live, and so would they. That night, she and Claire walked along the riverbank with flashlights. The moon reflected on the water, broken into 1,000 ripples. "So we're really keeping it?" Claire asked. "We are," Melissa said, "and we're making it work for us." Claire picked up a stone, tossed it into the current, and smiled. "Grandpa used to say you can't rush rivers." Melissa felt a lump in her throat. He was right, but sometimes, if you listen long enough, they tell you where to go. Within 2 months, the paperwork was complete. The Franklin County Council approved the designation of the mill site as a private natural resource property. It gave Melissa the right to operate as a small supplier, leasing a share of the spring's output to a regional bottling company under her own conditions. The deal was modest compared to Clearflow's offer, but it was steady income, and it allowed her to keep the land. She named the partnership Riverlight Source and registered it under her own newly restored real estate license. When the first payment arrived, Melissa drove into Portland and paid off her remaining debts. She handed the bank teller a cashier's check, her hand steady for the first time in years. "That's the last of it," she said. The woman behind the counter gave her a polite smile, unaware of how monumental the moment was. Walking back to her truck, Melissa felt lighter, as if the air itself had more space in it. Back at the mill, life began to find a rhythm again. Claire started homeschooling online, setting up her desk by the big window where the river could be seen. Ben still came by occasionally, not as a worker, but as a friend. Sometimes they would all sit outside in the evenings, roasting marshmallows over a small fire, listening to the steady sound of the water wheel turning gently in the current. The wheel had started to move more frequently now, driven by the restored flow beneath it. Its creak was no longer eerie. It was comforting, a heartbeat in wood and water. By autumn, the mill had changed. The boards were repaired, the roof replaced, and the smell of mold replaced by the faint scent of cedar. The once-forgotten building looked alive again. A carved sign hung above the door. Riverlight Mill, Est. 1904, restored 2024. Melissa had insisted on keeping the old year to honor its beginning, not its end. Sometimes she still thought about Clearflow's representative, about the kind of life she might have had if she'd sold the land and walked away. That life would have been easier, cleaner, perhaps even more respectable. But it would have been hollow. The kind of life that ends up filed away like an unused contract. Here, surrounded by the rhythm of water and the scent of wood, she felt something she hadn't in years. Permanence. It was late November when she received a call from a historical preservation society in Augusta. Someone had seen the registry notice about the restoration and wanted to include the mill in their annual heritage listings. "It's rare these days," the woman on the phone said, "for anyone to save a working mill. Most people tear them down. You've done something important." Melissa thanked her, though she wasn't sure what to say. She had done it for survival, not recognition. But perhaps, she thought, survival and restoration were just two sides of the same impulse to refuse disappearance. Winter settled over the valley in quiet layers. Snow lined the riverbanks, and the air turned sharp. The wheel slowed but didn't stop. Inside, the old beams groaned in the cold, but the stove kept the rooms warm. Claire hung her drawings on the walls, sketches of the river, the mill, the changing sky. One evening, as Melissa cleaned the kitchen, she found one of the drawings left on the table. It showed the mill not as it was, but as it might once have been. Freshly painted, bustling, light pouring from every window. Beneath it, Claire had written in small letters, "Still alive." Melissa stood for a long time looking at that drawing. Then she went upstairs and opened the small box from the attic, the one that had belonged to Ellen Brooks. Inside lay the same photograph of the woman and her family, the one she had found months before. She placed it on the mantel, beside the sign she had cleaned and restored. For a moment, she imagined Ellen standing there with her, sharing the silence. "We did it," Melissa whispered. "We kept it breathing." When spring returned, the thaw came early. The river swelled, but the new flood barriers Ben had built held firm. The water wheel spun freely, catching sunlight in its blades. Melissa stood by the edge, watching how the current shimmered. Her reflection wavered beside the moving water. Older, steadier, lined by struggle, but no longer broken. She had rebuilt more than a mill. She had rebuilt herself. She no longer planned to sell it. Instead, she turned the top floor into an office, painted the walls pale cream, and hung a new sign: Haven Realty, Historic Restorations and River Properties. Clients began to find her again, drawn by the story of the woman who bought a broken mill for $500 and turned it into a landmark. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same hands that once signed away homes were now keeping one alive. The first client who visited asked her, "Do you ever regret not selling?" Melissa smiled and looked toward the river. "No," she said simply. "Some things are worth more when they stay where they belong." On the day she officially closed her last outstanding account, she drove into town with Claire to celebrate. They had dinner at a small diner by the highway, the kind of place with neon lights and warm pie. Over coffee, Claire asked, "So what now? We're not leaving again, right?" Melissa shook her head. "No. We're home." The word felt unfamiliar on her tongue, but right. That evening, when they returned, the sun was setting behind the hills. The river shimmered gold, the light bending across the water wheel. Melissa paused at the gate, taking in the sight of their mill, the same walls that had once smelled of decay, now glowing with warmth. Claire ran ahead, laughing, her hair catching the last rays of sunlight. For a moment, Melissa saw her not as the child who had followed her through years of instability, but as the young woman she was becoming. Rooted, calm, certain of where she came from. Inside, the lamps flickered softly. Melissa stood by the window and looked out at the river one last time before night fully settled. The water flowed smooth and sure, whispering against the stones. She thought of all the places she had lived, all the houses she had sold, all the versions of herself she had left behind. None of them had felt as true as this. The mill had not just given her shelter. It had given her proof that broken things could still work, that old foundations could hold new lives. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass plaque she had ordered weeks ago. She screwed it onto the wall beside the door. The inscription was simple: "Bought for $500, worth much more than money." As she stepped back to read it, the evening wind drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of river water and pine. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, the spring whispered faintly, eternal and calm. The wheel outside turned once in the dark, its rhythm slow and certain, a quiet promise that life, even when forgotten, always finds its way forward. Melissa closed her eyes and listened, her hand resting on the cool wooden frame of the door. "Thank you," she murmured, to the land, to the river, to the woman she used to be. And as the stars began to appear above the valley, the mill stood steady in the night, no longer a ruin, but a living thing reborn. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the other stories waiting for you. Each one has something worth feeling. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.